I was emotionally terrified. I didn't sleep the night before. He drives the thing with this game controller. He uses rusty lead pipes from a construction industry as ballast. There were things that seemed sort of unsophisticated. And, of course, I brought this up with him. And he said, yeah, that's true, but these are just bells and whistles. The part that keeps you alive, the part we care about, is that carbon fiber cylinder and the titanium end caps that he designed in conjunction with NASA. And that, he said, is buttoned down.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. Only after David Pogue realized what had happened to the Titan, he said, I should not have been reassured by the Titan's 20 successful dives to the seafloor. I should have been terrified. Each dive brought the sub closer to destruction. And so one thing you may not be aware of is Pogue's terror the night before his scheduled dive. According to CBS News, well, you've just heard it, he said he was emotionally terrified and he didn't sleep the night before that he got into Titan. You heard him talking about him driving, Stockton Rush driving with his game controller using rusty lead pipes from the construction industry as ballast, things that seemed sort of unsophisticated. Interestingly, even though Pogue allowed his intellectual grasp to override his emotions, his emotional reality nevertheless spoke deeply about the reality of the situation he was in. His emotional reality seeped, I guess, into his subconscious, which is perhaps why he couldn't sleep that night. That emotional reality was sending off alarms, trying to keep its host alive. Sometimes we must listen to that gut feel, that intuition, even when we can't quite explain where it comes from. And that is the note that we left off the previous analysis on, was that the trick that Stockton Rush hadn't learned, knowing when to listen and knowing what to listen to. One of the many ironies of the Titan tragedy is it makes a mockery of bluster and hubris. If you take the name of the submersible, just that, it's a name that, like Titanic, is meant to seem grandiose. It evokes feelings of incredible strength and invincibility, and yet both the Titan and Titanic ended up as broken debris on the bottom of the ocean. The fault didn't so much lie in the materials used, although with the Titan, certainly the CEO could have chosen better than carbon fiber. And also with the Titanic, they could have kitted the ship out with a decent number of lifeboats. But the greater fault lies more with hubris and confidently and braggadociously assuming one knows more than one actually does. Incidentally, YouTube is chock full of confidence tricksters and big talkers, including and especially in true crime. Another parable from this tragedy is it reveals how some people, given a particular set of parameters, are unconvinced that, and they don't trust what they are being told, and rightly so, while others, given the same information, trusted it, relied on what they were told, were mistaken, and it ultimately cost them everything. Again, this idea of being too trusting with big sweeping statements is what led to the undoing of Titanic and Titan and all those who were on board. Pogue was right to be worried during that sleepless night, but he can be forgiven for being led astray, because we can also see how Stockton Rush and his acolytes would have been led astray by what would have appeared to be initial success. Remember, he did have a successful dive to Titanic, and then another one, and another one. And wouldn't you then say, well, he has succeeded? A successful dive to Titanic is a lot like summiting Mount Everest. And I'm going to do a video comparing the two. I've written quite a few books on the Everest disaster, and there are a lot of similarities. It's tempting to believe that when you're on top of the mountain, the risky part is over. But the experts know by far the majority of fatalities on Everest occur on the way down, when climbers begin to relax, when they get the sense that they've already done it, they've achieved their goal. And I fear that's what happened with the Titan. Once it made one successful attempt to Titanic, there was a sense that they'd done it, that they'd proved themselves, and there were other people who felt the same. And so it was on the other side of that mountain, where the hubris is settling in and piling on itself, that focus drops with catastrophic consequences. Does that make sense? And I can't help comparing this idea of trusting in the integrity of this hull to many people who trusting in this unverified transcript, in the same way that the hull was uncertified. You have people trusting in an unverified transcript. Is that so very different from the folks, the 5 victims, trusting in an uncertified craft? Is it? In this episode, we want to go beneath the veil, essentially point number 7 of the Pogue report, and examine the question I didn't quite get around to answering in the previous episode. What was the seminal moment in Stockton Rush's backstory? Also, what happened that sent him in a particular fateful direction, designing submersibles? Before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. Welcome to the thousands of you who have subscribed. If you're enjoying this episode, please like, share, leave a comment. You can also hit the thanks button, and let's get started. So what do I mean by beneath the veil, right? It's kind of a subtle thing, and once again we go back to the Pogue report where he writes the following, quote, anyone could see that Rush relished playing the maverick genius. More than once he compared his role as industry disruptor to Steve Jobs and Elon Musk. He seems to have exaggerated the role of Boeing and others and minimized the frequency of Titan's breakdowns. End quote. I have to say that one word I think really is a word that we need to write down and put on a post-it and remember with regard to the name Titan and the story surrounding Titan. Somebody associated with it was prone to exaggeration, right? And someone who exaggerates one thing and minimizes another thing, that is basically selective reasoning. That's being selective about reality right there. Magical thinking is tuning out the stuff, minimizing what you don't like, and tuning in, exaggerating the stuff that works for you. And so when we lift the veil and we look at his backstory, as David Pogue did in the Intelligencer, he covers something that is really important, is that this man wasn't satisfied with professionally built planes either, right? He describes Rush as a renegade who went on to build his own plane from a kit while studying aerospace engineering at Princeton. And he pulls that off. He succeeds at that. And you've heard him saying that he was very much in the right stuff mode. He builds a fiberglass airplane. He got exactly the same pushback from engineers that he got with the Titan. And this is the key part. The plane proved to be successful, and Pogue says, I think it emboldened him. What does he mean by that? I think it made him feel that I know more than others. I've got the right stuff, you don't, kind of thing. And he does make a really good point. He did go to Princeton. Do you really want to argue with someone who studied engineering at Princeton based on, well, what did you study?
It's interesting now. I mean, the narrative has now turned against Stockton Rush's design, and we should have seen this coming, and what an idiot. But please remember, this was a Princeton-educated aerospace engineer. He'd built and designed his own airplanes. He'd built and designed previous submersibles. This one was designed in conjunction with NASA. It had been to the seafloor 20 times uneventfully. There really is a lot of Monday morning quarterbacking going on here.
Yeah. I'm sure, like me, you don't completely agree with that statement, but that statement is valuable for how and why David Pogue, at a particular point in the narrative, believed Stockton Rush, and I'm sure it's also a reason why Stockton Rush believed himself. Did you go to Princeton? No? Well, I did. Have you built a aircraft? Well, I have. Pogue also highlights two things that you may not know about Stockton Rush. This other side to him, a kind of a daredevil. While at university, he was charged with drunk driving. In 1983, he crashed his Volkswagen into a shuttle train called the Dinky. And I've said it before, isn't what is going on here a situation, you may have heard of the saying, the only difference between men and boys are the price of their toys. This was a man wanting to go back to that sort of wild period of his youth when he was respected and loved and admired, in his latter years. Isn't that what this was largely all about? And I mean, one thing that was certainly assailing his sense of invincibility, his sense of immortality, was the fact that he had imperfect eyesight. And so Pogue writes, quote, "After imperfect eyesight dashed his dreams of becoming an astronaut, Rush considered buying a ticket for a future Virgin Galactic suborbital flight," end quote. So you literally have this hinge in time, and this is when we lift the veil, we see what is in a way hidden underneath that. We see that on the one hand, he is struggling with imperfect vision, and that is taking his dreams away from him. And so how does he try to make up for that? How does he try and restore the imbalance, this unfair thing that has happened in his life where, in a way, he's had a dream, is lived almost like the perfect life up to this point. And so he thinks, well, I'm going to buy a ticket onto a suborbital flight with Virgin Galactic. That is going to make up for this setback that I can't go into space myself. And then he realizes, actually, it's not. It's not going to make up for that. We're going to deal with that in a bit more detail in a moment. But there's also something deeply ironic about a man with imperfect vision having an imperfect vision about how to get tourists down to the Titanic. And then ultimately, this imperfect plan literally implodes. But I want to take you from that to a man standing in the Mojave Desert during a 2014 test. And what is this man doing? Is watching Branson showboat, to use David Pogue's description, on the wing of his grounded spacecraft. And what does this do? In Pogue's assessment, it turns him off. He's turned off by this idea of sanitized space tourism. He doesn't like this idea of somebody getting a ticket, right? And then going into space and sitting there as a passenger. And yet that is exactly what Stockton Rush, in a way, did with his own passengers. He took tourists into the deep ocean, and no matter how you want to dress it up, you can call them mission specialists, but all they're really doing is looking on their cell phones. There's not really a lot to do in a deep-sea submersible. But I think we need to pause on this particular point and just say, hold on. So the dude who wanted to be an astronaut his whole life, when he got the chance to go into space, when he's kind of on the cusp of doing that, you kind of get this idea that in a cowboy sense, he sort of spat into a spittoon, put on his cowboy hat, got on his horse, and rode out of town. So has Stockton Rush never actually been to space? So again, I think you've got to ask the question, why did he want to go into space in the first place? Was it because he really wanted to see space, or because of how impressive that would be to everybody else? The other thing that's really ironic is that this guy, this swashbuckler, was turned off by Branson showboating. This show subber and show shipper, as opposed to showboater, didn't like another man showboating. So what was he really on about? He says, I wanted to be the Captain Kirk of the Enterprise. I wanted to explore. Is that really true, though? In one interview, when he was asked how he reacted to seeing Titanic on the first dive for the first time, he admitted he didn't actually look at the Titanic until he viewed footage back on deck.
What were your first feelings and thoughts when you saw the Titanic for the very first time?
It was, I didn't really have a chance to absorb it until I got to the surface, back to the ship. Because when I was there, I had P.H. Nargeolet, who's an expert on the Titanic, and he and I were navigating while all the mission specialists were in the dome looking at it. And so I'm just trying to make sure we don't touch it, we stay off, we get great pictures, we get great light. When I got to the surface was this amazing thing.
When he gets to the surface, there's champagne, there's photos, there's pats on the back, there's that Tom Cruise Maverick moment where everybody celebrates their hero. But isn't it strange that, they are down there for hours, that he doesn't actually even seem to move forward and have a look at the Titanic himself and enjoy that thing. If he did, he doesn't mention it in this interview. And this is why I suspect his Captain Kirk comment is more on the mark than it seems. But what he meant about Captain Kirk wasn't so much about wanting to be that character, but wanting to be liked, like that character was liked, wanting to be the charismatic hero at the center of adventures and stories about adventures. Yes, to boldly go where no man has gone before, but it's a lot more conceited than that, isn't it? It's to be filmed, interviewed, photographed, boldly going. And like Star Trek, so what if your craft is sort of a fake prop? So what if it doesn't actually work? Let the showboating continue. So what if your craft is named after something that is ostensibly very strong when you know that it actually isn't? And you don't need a real certified craft for you to still be the star at the center of your own universe. And so this is the critical point that David Pogue makes. He talks about Rush changing his trajectory, right? The moment that he sees Richard Branson in the Mojave Desert in 2014, he changes his trajectory. He starts to piece together his first submarine, and he's thinking, I want to be the Richard Branson, the Elon Musk, the Jeff Bezos of the deep ocean. I also want to kind of be a Jim Cameron, but in sort of active service. That seems to be his motivation. Do you agree? One aspect in the Pogue report that I found difficult to believe, and I'm not sure if I do believe, is he makes a reference to Mike Rice, the writer and producer on The Simpsons, who said, this is not an unexpected way for him to die. I bet he expected to go this way. Do you agree with that? I suspect he wanted to do one more dive that's in this year, in this season, and then during the off-season, perhaps he would have ordered another new hull. Perhaps he was running a little low on cash and he could use Hamish and the Suleimans combined $750,000 for that. But reality was always going to catch up with him sooner or later. In the end, like the creators and passengers of the Titanic, he was a victim of his own all-consuming, self-aggrandizing fairy tale. And in the same way they created an idol of modern machinery and marveled at their own grandiosity, one has the sense that he hadn't grown up into his own person either. Hero-worshipping Musk or James Cameron, all of that is fine when you're a teenager or a young adult. As an older person, presumably, you've found your own voice. I'm not sure he found his. He wanted to be Captain Kirk, boldly going, yet he couldn't handle criticism of what he was doing, even though Captain Kirk often did. What's the difference? Even the fictional Captain Kirk deserved his place on the bridge. The captain of the Ocean Gate had basically cheated his way through the system. Also, why was he so driven in the first place, when somehow has the feeling he was being outshone by his own privilege, by the stories of his wife's relatives and his own great-great-grandparents, and perhaps as a young lad for a while, he was on his way to becoming a legend of his own making, until he wasn't, until his eyesight got in the way. And then what happened? He faded and fizzled into the ordinary land of business school, ultimately waking up one day to find he'd become Mr. Ordinary. And in his middle age, seeing Richard Branson in the flesh, his craft emblazoned with Branson heraldry, I think Stockton Rush felt envy. It wasn't that he didn't want to go into space or that he didn't want to be a mere passenger. He wanted to be the star of his own show. But more than that, he simply wanted to be a star. He wanted to be a standout figure like Branson, like Musk, like Jim Cameron, like Jeff Bezos. He'd awakened into a midlife crisis and suddenly realized he had something to prove. Does that make sense? I don't know if it's a coincidence that everyone on board Mission 4 had something to prove as well. They were all males, all 48 years of age or older, and the only teenager on board likely felt, in the presence of his old man, that he had something to prove as well. So do you see, the Titan in a sense wasn't what it was. It wasn't this powerful vessel. It also wasn't a defective, weak, little grey worm. Instead, it was something else completely. It was a symbol of a pupa that men thought they could climb into and emerge afterwards, shining and new as brave new heroes. I'm not going to take it further than that, but I do want to do a follow-up episode where we deal with this idea of why was he so driven That is a question that deserves its own separate analysis. And so we'll be looking at that, as I say, in the next episode. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.